Hello everyone. Good afternoon from Oxford. I know we've got loads of people joining us from around the world. So good evening, good morning, depending where you're calling in from today. Do say hello in the chat. It's always so great to see people joining us from across sectors and across continents. Thank you very much for joining us for the first Engaging with Evidence webinar session of 2022 and the 10th since we first launched this series a year ago, almost to the day when we launched it back a year ago in January 2021. My name is Laura Bonsaver. I am Policy and Engagement Associate here at the Government Outcomes Lab based in the University of Oxford, and I'm absolutely delighted to be co-hosting this session today with my colleague Tanyah Hameed. For today's session, we'll be drawing on the latest research on the cost effectiveness of outcomes-based contracting in education by looking at a number of education interventions in India and across the world in various contexts. We'll be looking at the nuances, the complexities and the realities of measuring cost effectiveness of outcomes-based funding and what this means for accountability in the field. With so few economic evaluations of outcomes-based funding, we are really excited to hear the insights from the research today and our wonderful panel of speakers. As always, we'll be discussing implications for policymakers and practitioners working on the ground. So for those of you who might not know our work so well, we are a research and policy centre based here at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. We were created 5 years ago as a partnership between the UK government and the Blavatnik School here at the university. We investigate how governments around the world can partner with the private sectors and the social sectors to improve social outcomes. So we'll also look at innovative financing tools in outcomes-based funding and such as social impact bonds. Alongside our research, we have a multifaceted programme of engagement and capacity building to ensure that any of the research that we're bringing out and anything from around the world is made accessible and can be used in policy and in practice. Which brings us to the Engage with Evidence series. We're now on our first birthday here in 2022. We launched it a year ago, and it's basically a platform to bring together policymakers, practitioners, and academics into the same space and discuss all the latest research in the field. And also, most importantly, it is grounded in research, but it is an open discussion here to talk also about the practical considerations for those working on the ground. For our next session, we've got on the 9th of March, we'll be exploring insights from the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond, which is a poverty alleviation project in Uganda and Kenya. It's looking to be a really interesting session, which like today is in partnership with the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, or FCDO. Coming back to today's session, we're going to follow a similar structure to previous sessions, starting with a couple of short presentations and followed by a panel discussion. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Emily Gustafsson-Wright, who will set the context on the challenges within UK education around the world and the use of outcomes-based funding globally. We'll then hear from Dayang Lian Gagandeep Nanda from Dalberg on the cost effectiveness of outcomes-based funding in India. And then for the second part of the session, my colleague Tanyah will moderate a discussion with our wonderful panel of speakers. We'll be hearing practitioner insights from Krisha Mathur from the British Asian Trust and Milena Castelnou from Education Outcomes Fund, insights from government from Grace Wood, who works for FCDO, and a research perspective from our academic director, Mada Adaldi. We like to keep the sessions interactive, so if you have any questions or reflections during the session, please do raise your hand or put the questions in the chat and we can come to you between presentations. Please note that we are recording the session and we will be showing the recording on the website and our YouTube channel after the session. You'll also find the slides on our website, which we can link in the chat. Final thing, it's always so lovely to see everyone's faces, so do keep your camera on if you can or if you like. And just a reminder to stay muted during the session when others are speaking. Great, I think that's all the housekeeping reminders for the session. So I really hope that you all enjoy this session. We've got a really great set of speakers lined up. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Emily. Emily, if you'd first like to introduce yourself, that would be great. Over to you.
Absolutely. Good morning and good afternoon and evening to everybody. Thanks to GoLab for the invitation. It's great to be here and with all of my colleagues on this great panel. So I'm Emily. I'm an economist based in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. My career has focused mainly on researching human development, so education, health, social protection. Since about 2014, I've been leading a team at Brookings researching outcomes-based financing across the globe and have published over a dozen studies on the topic. I'm particularly passionate about early childhood development and have developed a cost calculator for early childhood development and education, which I will share more about later, which is particularly relevant to today's session. So let's jump into the slides. So I'll kick us off today with some scene setting about the global education sector, the challenges we face in the sector, and landscape also of impact bonds and outcomes fund for education. So to start, even before the pandemic, we were facing a crisis in the education sector. While much progress had been made in the last 2 decades, we were still facing dismal statistics. So UNESCO data from 2019 showed that there were 58 million children of primary school age that were not in school. The majority of those were and continue to be in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia. On the next slide, we can see that beyond children being out of school, we face a learning crisis. And that includes even those children many children who are in school. In 2019, before the pandemic, 53% of children aged 10 in low and middle income countries were considered to be in so-called learning poverty, meaning that they couldn't read a simple text by the age of 10. The pandemic has, of course, made matters even worse. Today, it's estimated that this number has risen to between 63 and 70%. This generation of students now risks losing $17 trillion US dollars in lifetime earnings in present value, or about 14% of today's global GDP. On the next slide, we can see that the outcomes focus can improve the likelihood of addressing the learning crisis. It's not the panacea, but this outcomes focus that outcomes-based financing brings tends to bring more clearly defined and measurable outcomes, also can provide flexibility to tailor interventions to learner and contextual needs, and also can strengthen ecosystems for more sustainable impact. And finally, the contingent payments utilize limited budgets wisely. And we'll hear more about this in our discussion today. So there are almost 30 impact bonds that have been contracted across the world in the education sector, depending on how you count. Portugal is in the lead with 10 impact bonds out of a total 16 in the country being in the education sector. In addition to those contracted impact bonds, there are a number of impact bonds and outcome funds. Actually, still I haven't moved on to the next slide. Thanks. There are a number of outcome funds in the works globally, such as the Education Outcomes Fund, which will be launching programs in Ghana and Sierra Leone, as well as other countries likely in the future. And you'll hear more about that today. And the Back to School Outcomes Fund in India, the Outcomes Fund for Education Results or Offer in Canada, by the Canadians in Colombia, and another fund for education in Chile. So there's a lot that's coming up in the future, and you'll see this trend towards outcomes funds away from individual impact bonds. So in the next slide, we can see that the majority of impact bonds thus far in the education sector target primary education, with 19 impact bonds in primary education. And that's followed by secondary level with 10, and then pre-primary with 6, and the fewest at the tertiary level. Note that some impact bonds cover multiple age groups, so that's why the number doesn't sum to the total number of impact bonds. In the next slide, you can see that the interventions in the education sector in impact bonds cover basically 4 categories. So the first category is teacher and administrative support, with 4 impact bonds that use that type of intervention, 6 with family support, and 16 that provide direct student support, and then 7 education technology or ed tech. So you can see that the majority are direct student support and then followed by ed tech. So of the contracted impact bonds in the education sector, 3 have been in low and middle income countries, or actually middle income countries. Educate Girls Development Impact Bond in Rajasthan, India, which many of you have heard about, which focused on out-of-school girls. The Impact Bond Innovation Fund in the Western Cape in South Africa, which notably was a SIB, meaning that there was a government outcome funder. And this was a home visiting program for preschool age children. And the Quality Education DIB, which is still ongoing with 4 different interventions: principal and teacher training, direct school management, remedial teaching, and computer-based adaptive learning across 4 states in India. So what have we seen in terms of results of these impact bonds? So just focusing on the last 3 that are in LMICs. So in the final year, the Educate Girls DIB achieved 116% of the enrollment target and 160% of the learning target. IBIF, for the Impact Bond Innovation Fund, achieved the recruitment and retention targets and averaged across all years the attendance targets. The learning targets were not met, but did show improvement, and the pandemic made measurement a challenge in the final year as it closed in 2020. For the Quality Education DIB, after the second year of implementation, despite the pandemic and many setbacks, the QEI DIB was achieving 2 to 3 times its learning targets. This year will be the end of the 4th year, and measurements which were paused due to the pandemic impacts will resume. So a lot has been learned from all the impact bonds implemented in the education sector thus far, and we've seen much of the learnings being taken up in subsequent projects, which has really been fantastic. I look forward to the rest of the conversation today, in which we'll discuss how cost effectiveness of interventions come into play in outcomes-based financing space, and what types of data and other tools that are needed to design and implement outcomes-based financing successfully. If you're interested in exploring more of our research, including several blogs and reports about the impact bonds that I mentioned and that we'll hear about today, you can check out the Brookings website for more information, and perhaps Sarah, who's on my team, can pop that link into the chat. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thanks so much for that, Emily, for setting up really helpful context for the state of global education post and pandemic and education interventions around the world. For anyone who does have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll leave a bit of time after the next presentation as well for questions. So at any point that you have in your reflections, feel free to raise your hand or pop it in the chat. Amazing, right, so we're going to go on to the next presentation of the session. Gagandeep and Tanyah, who will now tell us about their research on the cost effectiveness of these kind of programs articulated by Emily. So over to you both. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks, Emily, for that excellent overview. My name is Tanyah. I'm a global co-lead of the Education to Employment practice at Dalberg. And along with my colleague Gagan, we've been really managing this performance of the Quality Education India Development Impact Bond that Emily alluded to. Over the last almost 4 years, it's been a roller cycle ride, a lot of fun as well as really challenging. And one of the key outcomes that we sought out to from the get-go was actually to understand what cost effectiveness of education interventions in a context like India look like. Because there was such a lack of data around what outcomes should cost. And one of the key learning agenda points was to really test out different models, from EdTech to remedial teaching and learning to teacher training and so forth, to understand what differences there are in not only the level of impact it can achieve, but for what cost. And so we really leveraged all the rich data that we collected on the impact. As you can imagine, given that an impact bond, there's such a high cost to failure and achievement, there's really excellent, some of the best in class and purest learning outcome data. Alongside that, of course, there's a lot of good cost data as well. So we built on that to understand what cost effectiveness in a context like India might look like. And Tanya, if you move to the next slide. So as the DIB is coming to an end in this academic year, we really wanted to zoom out and answer these 3 questions for the field. First is to assess whether there's a case for outcomes-based financing in the sense that, does it actually pay off? Are the returns worth all the potential additional costs involved? Secondly, to reduce the cost of negotiating these prices each time by shedding light on how much learning outcomes should cost in a context like India. And finally, to facilitate discovery of cost-effective interventions for future investments. So what are the types of interventions that policymakers, as well as funders and philanthropies should look to invest going forward? And this, we felt, would be really helpful to scale the landscape of outcomes-based financing going forward. And as Emily alluded to, right now we are actually in the design phase of the Back to School Outcomes Fund, a much larger outcomes fund that's not only the impact bond, but will have an accelerated component, a district challenge, but essentially a lot of the lessons around what we learned, what works and what doesn't, for how much, have been informing that design. And we hope that there's a lot of other use cases like this going forward. So before we dive into what we found, just a quick note on our methodology. It was a 4-step process in a nutshell. First, building on the QEI data, we also collected data from other programs out there. So in all, reviewed 30+ program data. And we set a pretty high bar for what good looks like. So looked for things like having a good comparison group, third-party evaluation, meaningful sample sizes, and the results being statistically significant. And that left us with about 23 programs. Then we categorized that to by type of intervention. And after kind of making sure that we have enough number of programs per intervention type, we found that there are about 6 that we can have meaningful insights from. And then the other piece of methodology that's really key here was to normalize the results into a single comparable metric. In our case, we chose the EYOS metric, the equivalent years of schooling, which measures essentially how much, in addition to what an average child in India in a government school would be learning, did these interventions generate. And then we made sure all of the cost data, on the other hand, were also like for like, things like adjusting for inflation, because the interventions were at various different points of time, and making sure we're accounting correctly for what are some of the direct versus indirect costs. And Emily can tell us more about the cost calculator that she's working on. But a lot of the thinking went into making sure that these cost effectiveness results are apples to apples. And then finally, we spend quite a bit of time also pressure testing the findings to make sure they're reasonable through experts, practitioners, and ensuring that they are not just figures, but really we are able to caveat also under what circumstances will different service providers or implementing partners were able to achieve these results, to be able to make sense out of them and be able to provide guidelines for when they're more or less applicable. We move to the next slide, Tanya. So what do we find? In terms of the why, just looking at the QEI data, where there were 4 different models that we were testing, each of them were also funded in a smaller scale earlier through a grant program as well. And so there was a good comparison, similar intervention by the same provider, and we had both the cost and the learning outcomes data. And with the enhanced accountability, transparency, the flexibility to actually change the intervention and pivot if things were not working out, and not necessarily having to deliver on certain activities and inputs, but being accountable for that end learning outcome. And the constant emphasis and support on monitoring and evaluation, we found that these same interventions were able to achieve 50% higher learning outcomes. And the costs, a little bit surprising even to us, were not actually that much higher. There were some of those transaction costs, if you will, but because by this time the interventions were a bit more mature and it had gone through a round of negotiations as well, it wasn't that necessarily the costs were higher. And so, at least from the context of the QEI data, we felt like the outcomes-based mechanism was a really good deal. It was a smart buy in any sense. But also for our audience, we wanted to make sure that it's not just this impact bond instrument that can deliver these types of results, right? There are many other ways for outcomes-based financing, and especially for a government audience or the policymakers who may be part of this group as well. We've seen lots of smart contracting. So selecting partners based on their past performance, not only sort of number of children reached, but really based on the learning outcomes they were able to achieve, and multi-stage contracting, so that you start with a smaller contract and those who are delivering really good outcomes get larger and larger, let's say, number of schools to serve, or bonuses and penalties built in. And we also saw that in some of the programs that we looked at the data for, where there were incentives for the end beneficiary or the participant, like the teachers or the children themselves, even if it's non-monetary, oftentimes it wasn't monetary, but a recognition or award or time to extra time to play games with the edtech platforms that they were provided, actually made a meaningful difference to the results. And so building in those incentives for the participants directly would be another suggestion that we have. And moving to the next insight, which is really the how of this, how to get there. We found that an additional investment of just $13 to $40 per student per year leads to, in high quality interventions, can lead to an additional year worth of gains in learning in a context of India. And so again, this figure may look different depending on the market, but with not that much money, and this ends up being about 15% of annual spend from the Indian government per child, you can get potentially huge impacts in an effective intervention. So I'll now pass it along to my colleague Gagan, who is really the co-pilot with me on the study and the QEI journey as well.
Thanks so much, Tanyah. So I am now going to take a few minutes and walk you through our findings related to the question around what type of education interventions to invest in. So as we know, the current context is that schools have been closed for almost 2 years in India. I mean, yes, they did open up on few occasions, but it was only for a few weeks, and that too, with the limited attendance. And in these last 2 years, there is growing evidence that students lost out on foundational skills. Right? But despite these nationwide losses, what we found from our experience with the QEI service providers is that interventions that successfully combine physical and digital components, that is the phygital models, they have shown to achieve meaningful gains even during that school closure period, right? And that's essentially because both the physical and the digital models, they have their own value propositions. So for example, while digital models allow for interventions to happen even during closures, the physical models, they not only help enhance the reach for students that do not have access to these digital devices, but they are also much better from an engagement standpoint, from a control standpoint, from a peer learning standpoint, all of which is sort of very, very difficult to do on a digital basis, right? So we sort of saw our service providers constantly shifting between the physical models and the digital models, depending upon whether the schools were open and what was possible, what was not possible. And we saw that they were able to demonstrate meaningful gains even within this very difficult period. Tanyah, we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So that's what you do during school closures, right? You sort of mix the physical and the digital models. I think the next question is, what do we do once schools, open up and students start coming back to school, right? So the context is, as I was mentioning earlier, there have been losses in terms of foundational skills. So student learning levels will be much lesser than before. And there will be much more variance as well within those learning levels, right? Because people have had varied access to remote learning. So therefore, as schools open up, we need to be much more intentional about which interventions do we really choose, right? So our study found that remedial interventions and TAL interventions, which is basically teaching at the right level, these interventions are very, very cost effective. They can essentially result in another year's worth of learning at just about INR 1,000 to 2,000 per student, right? So that's about 13 to about $30. And these are also effective in low resource settings, right? So where you don't have a lot of infrastructure, you don't have great quality teachers. Even in those sort of settings, these interventions are very, very useful. Then adaptive edtech, while effective in high resource settings, it is the only intervention where we were able to find any quantitative evidence of cost effectiveness in middle grades. And because of its adaptive nature, it can also very effectively tackle the point around variance in learning levels of students that I was alluding to earlier. And then finally, we have the non-adaptive edtech, which is very effective when implemented as a complement versus as a substitute to high quality instruction, and it needs some level of supervision. Thanks. So those were some of the findings from our study. But going forward, as we look to scale outcomes-based mechanisms, there is a need to do a few additional things, right? So firstly, from a capability standpoint, we do need to build the outcome readiness of implementing organizations. So ensuring that they have MEL capabilities, ensuring that they have focus on precise execution planning. They're able to adapt in settings like what we have seen in the last 2 years, and are flexible and nimble, right? Secondly, I think we need to have a much stronger evidence base. We found it really difficult to collect data, and ultimately we were only able to collect data, robust data, where we had both the cost data as well as the effectiveness data, only for 6 intervention types, right? But there are so many different interventions that are out there. So therefore, we need to have a much more stronger evidence base. Not just on the type of intervention, but even within interventions, right? So for example, gender disaggregated data to understand differentiated impacts. We need to fund for interventions in areas where there are big evidence gaps. So middle and senior grades, low capacity states or low capacity settings, rural areas, students with disability, so on and so forth. And our study, I think, has several broader implications for different stakeholders, right? Some of them have already been covered in terms of what interventions to target, when to target them. So I won't go into those, but there are a few additionally important implications as well, right? So from a government standpoint, as Dayong was also alluding to earlier, an important question to think of is how can governments really integrate a stronger outcomes focus into procurement, right? And this does not need to happen through impact bonds or other outcome-based instruments, but you can also drive an outcomes focus through smarter contracting, as Tanyah mentioned, right? And here we have seen some examples. So for example, in Andhra Pradesh, which is a state in India, in an adaptive edtech pilot, implementers were guaranteed a minimum number of school allocations at scale if they met certain performance metrics in a pilot that was conducted, right? Similarly, in another state in India, Haryana, a cell has been set up to track outcome achievement at a state, district, block, and school level, right? So basically going outside of the formal outcomes-based instruments to think of smarter ways of having the outcome focus, right? And then for funders and implementers also, there are certain implications. I think the study does set some important benchmarks for what the funder should be targeting in terms of cost per outcome. So while funding, funders can target approximately INR 3,000 per student per year of learning gains. And on the implementer side, while designing interventions, implementers can aim to reach a similar sort of a figure. Tanya, we can move on. Thanks. And lastly, I think I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the methodology. We covered it at a high level initially, but we thought we could spend a little bit more time on some principles to keep in mind while doing such studies on cost effectiveness, right? I think we spent a fair bit of time in just aligning on how to make things and the findings easy to understand, meaningful, but while at the same time also be able to pass the quality bar, right? So we thought that it will be useful to share the process a little bit. I think the first is just choosing the right metric for comparison. Easy to understand, widely recognized, comparable, meaningful. So we chose equivalent years of schooling as the metric, which is World Bank recognized, and Dayong mentioned about it. That fit the criteria over here. There were several other metrics that we considered to initially as well, like standard deviations, so on and so forth. But we felt that they would have not been very easy to understand from a lay audience perspective. So that is one, right? And secondly, and very importantly, the evidence needs to strike the right balance between quality of data and being meaningful. So it is important to strike this balance because on one hand, if you keep the bar very high, you would have too few studies to leverage data from, right? But on the other hand, if you relax the criteria too much, then it would not fit the quality bar. So essentially, we used experimental / quasi-experimental studies, were mostly conducted by third parties, 500 plus students at least. These were at least conducted in the last 5 years, or if they were older, we ensured that these studies have been cited in reputable publications quite often, right? And of course, the results had to be statistically significant. Yeah, and then I think it's also important to choose the right price point for what you essentially call a smart buy. So provide a range that ensures enough interventions or organizations can deliver within that budget. But it should not be set too high so that it becomes a poor deal for buyers. Yeah, and so while those are the principles to keep in mind while coming up with the methodology and the process for some of the technical pieces, I think there are also a few principles to keep in mind while communicating the findings, right? So is there, for example, any inherent bias that you are dealing with? Are any of the findings counterintuitive? And if so, how do you deal with that, right? So for example, in this study, essentially we are dealing with an inherent bias, right? So organizations that have shared permissions with us to use the data are likely to have had higher effects. So these benchmarks on price per outcomes are probably the best in class, but they may not be true for all the organizations. It is still useful because it provides those organizations which are far away from these benchmarks an indication of what to aim for, right? So it's important to keep this bias in mind. Similarly, it's important to sort of see if any of the findings are seeming counterintuitive, and therefore it is important to pressure test them, speak to experts, figure out why the findings would be as they are. So, for example, one counterintuitive finding that we found was that non-adaptive edtech essentially doing better than adaptive edtech, right? We have heard so much wonderful things about adaptive edtech, about how the platform can adapt and so on and so forth. But we actually found that non-adaptive edtech is more cost effective. But does it happen always? No. This was only true when non-adaptive edtech was used as a complement to high quality instruction and with supervision. If you do it as a substitute, the findings are otherwise. So those are a few things to keep in mind. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for that. And thank you also to everyone asking questions in the chat. I think it's become very active and it's really great to already see our panelists responding to our questions. So yeah, do join in on that. Thanks so much for that presentation. We've got like a minute or so for questions. So anyone who does want to raise their hand, do feel free to. I guess as a question from me, do you have any just top tip recommendations for someone who's starting an outcomes-based contract or wondering, how to go about understanding cost effectiveness of the mechanism? What would be your top recommendation coming out of this research?
Yeah, I think from this research, I would say, first of all, I think those benchmarks are important, right? I don't think those benchmarks would apply to, let's say other countries like developed countries, so on and so forth. But I think it's important to sort of have those benchmarks in mind, and sort of try pushing organizations to sort of fall within those ranges, right? Not be too far away. Even if they are too far away currently, then over a period of time they can sort of get there. I think the second important recommendation or important finding, I would say, is that we did find that outcomes-based mechanisms end up being more cost effective and end up being very effective as well, right? But that only happens if you give a certain degree of flexibility to the underlying organizations, right? And give them that confidence and support them in a manner that they are able to succeed. We have had relationships with our service providers for over, I think, 3.5 years now, and the fantastic results that I think QAI saw over those first 2 years, and even within that COVID period, I think it would have not been possible if that flexibility would have not been offered, if that relationship of trust would have not been there. So while those hard numbers and those quantitative things are there, I think these softer aspects are sort of also important in a consortium like setting. Dayang, anything from your side?
Laura, do I have time to add just one more?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that there's not going to be perfect data, right? So if you're looking for that excellent, clean data across the board, that's going to be like, this is the answer, you're not going to find it. But good enough, clean enough data to draw meaningful enough insights are there. And so don't be discouraged, do a little bit of work, but it can give you real helpful direction. For example, $13 to $40 is what we found, right? In this context, pre-COVID, it wasn't $2 to $3, it wasn't $500. Even that range, our stakeholders found incredibly helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, very encouraging, because I think that's often a challenge in this sector, I think, the availability of data. So yeah, thanks very much for that. Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands up at the moment. I know we've got a really interesting panel discussion coming up. So I'll now pass on to my colleague Tanyah. Thank you very much, all the speakers that have gone so far, and yeah, enjoy the next part of the session. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. Hi everyone, and thanks once again for joining us for the session today. And special thanks to Emily, Dayang, and Gagan for the brilliant presentations in the first part. My name is Tanyah Hameed, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate at the Government Outcomes Lab. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm really excited for the next part of our session, which is going to be a panel discussion. We're really lucky to have with us today academics and practitioners from a range of sectors and international experiences who will build on the insights shared in the first part of the session. And so in today's discussion, we will be looking at two main themes. Firstly, we'll be exploring the role of outcomes-based financing in improving learning outcomes and enhancing accountability. And secondly, we'll be looking at practical considerations for both policymakers and practitioners. And of course, along the way, we will be discussing adaptation to COVID-19. Please do keep dropping any questions or comments into the chat, and we'll check back on these very shortly. So to kick us off, I'd like to come to our panelists one by one, and it would be fantastic if you could please introduce yourself and in particular, the perspective that you are bringing today. We have, of course, already heard from Emily, Dayang, and Gagan, so I'll be coming to the rest of our panelists first in alphabetical order. So starting with Grace, Krisha, Mara, and Milena. So over to you first, Grace.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Grace. I'm the Education Advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in Ghana. I've worked previously in Pakistan and the UK, supporting the Global Partnership for Education. And since 2018 in Ghana, I've been working with the government here, the World Bank and others to design and launch outcomes-based programs. Predominantly, the World Bank managed $218 million Ghana Accountability for Learning Outcomes project, and within this, a $30 million Ghana Education Outcomes project that we've been working on with the Education Outcomes Fund. FCDO is an outcomes funder for the GEOP, providing $22 million, million pounds from 2020 until 2025. That's about 85% of the funds, with the government of Ghana providing the rest. I'm happy to talk about more of that during the panel discussion today.
Thanks so much, Grace. On to you, Krisha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tanyah, and thanks to all my fellow colleagues here. It's been a very interesting discussion so far. I'm Krisha. I'm a social finance manager with the British Asian Trust. I work at the British Asian Trust on several innovative financing programs on education, including the Quality Education Impact Bond that everyone's been talking about today. But apart from that, also a smaller EdTech program called the Bharat EdTech Fund, and the new upcoming Back to School Fund in Education. Apart from this, previously, I've also worked in the healthcare space in India, and looking forward to joining this conversation today with everyone.
Thank you, Krisha. Then we have Mara and Milena.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mara Roldi. I am the academic director at the Government Outcomes Lab. By background, I'm an economist and a decision analyst. So I've always enjoyed looking at what is the evidence and what is the insight as a way to structure the way we make better decisions. I work in particular on healthcare in the past, where interestingly enough, there is a good outcome metric. And the question is, how should we invest the resources to maximize the achievement of this outcome? And what I bring to the Go Lab in this conversation is looking at this type of way of approaching the work. So it was very good to be on a session talking about cost effectiveness, very familiar to in my past life.
Thank you, Mara. And finally, we have Milena.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'm Milena Castelnou. I'm Chief Programs Officer at the Education Outcomes Fund. I've spent the last 6 years probably designing outcomes-based financing programs in a range of sectors, but particularly in the education space in low and middle income countries. So very excited to be part of this discussion. And maybe to say just a couple of words on EOF. So the Education Outcomes Fund was set up precisely to launch outcomes-based financing programs at scale to improve learning outcomes for children and employment outcomes for youth. So we're about to launch 2 large-scale outcomes funds, and I will tell you a little bit more about this in the course of the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. It's so great to have such a wealth of experience and knowledge with us today from across different countries, as well as different sectors. So to begin with, I'd like to come to you first, Grace and Mara. So in your experience, what are the rationales behind using outcomes-based financing in education? And in particular, what are some key drivers and expected benefits behind using this model? It would be great to understand this from a government perspective from you, Grace, and from a research and evidence perspective from you, Mara. So over to you first, Grace, and then Mara.
Thanks so much, Tanyah. So I think the FCDO's interest in outcomes-based financing in the education sector, as well as other sectors, comes from a desire to link together impact with financing, increasing the focus on results and end outcomes for children, and trying to make the whole process more efficient, both for the UK government as a key donor and development partner, but also for the governments that we work with and try to support in the education space. So I think it's that alignment of financing with what are we trying to achieve. We've got extensive experience of financing for activities, for outputs, and doing a lot of stuff, a lot of projects, a lot of programs, but then learning outcomes, our learning levels are still low, there are still children out of school, the quality of education isn't there yet. And so I think our interest really comes from trying to increase value for money in various constrained fiscal spaces, and also really trying to encourage and incentivize innovation and creativity. New ways to solve these problems, focused around how do we get to that goal, how do we get to that outcome, rather than what are the inputs. And I think in Ghana, we've also been really keen to, broaden out the market a bit as well. Often there are, specific organisations that support governments to deliver, but we see so many other organisations on the ground being really effective in rural and remote communities with people facing disadvantage in urban areas who don't get a look in. And so these kinds of models, we think, can also help to bring in some of those other players, as well as new social investment, to all collaborate to drive improvements on outcomes for children.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Grace. Could I come to you next, Mara, to talk about it from a more research and evidence perspective?
Yes, I build on what Grace has just said, because the motivator of working with an outcome-based approach, result-based financing, is, as Grace said, really trying to make the best use of limited resources. So there are so many needs that needs to be met. So we want to use every dollar as well as we can. And so this explains the interest of government, international development agencies, philanthropic organizations to pay for outcomes. However, I want to highlight 3 pieces, like one important piece of research, and then highlight 2 reports. One, the piece of evidence is the evaluation that was done of the phase 1 of the Girls' Education Challenge, which is a 12-year program that FCDO has been involved in, is still ongoing, to reach girls that are excluded from education. And at the end of phase 1, a big highlight was result-based finances is interesting, but there are so many NGOs struggling to finance themselves. Even when the outcome payments is as low as just 10%, small NGOs really struggle to work in that model. And this is an interesting starting point, because I want to highlight what comes from the research and the statement from the Impact Bond Innovation Fund in South Africa and the Quality Education India. In both cases, the ability to mobilize private capital came up front and center in why in education we might want to use result-based financing and an impact investor or somebody providing upfront capital. And mobilizing private capital, giving access to capital are the terminology used, as well as I'm reading from the report, catalyzing innovation in the service, in service delivery, improve quality of service, or improve performance management. And in particular for India, there was also an appetite to galvanize high-performing NGOs. So there are NGOs that seem to work very well, but they don't work very well with each other, and they don't do performance management very well. And echoes a little bit what Grace was saying about the work of broaden out the market. So can we create some strengths? So I think this chimes in, and the evidence to date is emerging very slowly, like in terms of quantitative studies, they are limited, but there are qualitative one coming through. And it seems the key findings for education is that there is indeed a shift to outcomes. I don't know if you read the work by, from Clist. It's there. There is more performance management, and I think the presentation by colleagues at Dalberg showed them how there was performance management, and also in the chat there was a conversation of this fear of cherry picking results. It seems that hasn't materialized in this Indian program, and also in Educate Girls there was not much cherry picking taking place, in part because we are building on what we learned from past programs. Everybody complains about cherry picking. We are improving how we design the outcome metrics, and it seems to pay out. So qualitative evidence emerging that this ambition of creating some innovation and create collaboration across the stakeholder is there. A big question mark on the cost. The evidence is a bit mixed, like is it worth the additional cost? But even there, although the evidence is more mixed, I'm thinking in particular at the report that Ecoris did for the FCDO DIPS. They pointed out that the cost during the implementation actually seemed comparable to cost of traditional funding models. So a lot of attention is being paid on the transaction cost of impact bonds. It might be higher, but it's always important to look at the cost of business as usual. And when that was done, the evidence is a bit mixed. Sometimes it seems more, sometimes it's really the same. So this is the evidence to date, but with all the program being listed by Emily at the start, I think there will be a lot of opportunity of learning more going forward.
Thank you very much both for explaining some of those key drivers and rationales. Krisha and Milena, if I can bring you into the conversation next. You both have a lot of experience in the design, setting up, and implementation of initiatives in this area. So could you perhaps give us a few examples of how outcomes-based financing is being used in education, especially within the Quality Education India DIB and within the Education Outcomes Fund, both of which have been mentioned? And also, what are some examples of this beyond impact bonds? Are there any other alternative outcomes-based models that you would like to highlight? So over to you first, Krisha, and then to you, Milena.
Thanks, Tanya. So first, let me say a few things about the British Asian Trust, and I can give a couple of examples on how outcomes are being driven through innovative financing programs. So we worked. So the British Asian Trust is a diaspora-led foundation. We're based out of the UK. Education is a large part of our portfolio, and we've actually done grant making for several years before we started working on innovative financing tool. In India, where we worked on the Quality Education India DIB, and that was the first one where we acted as co-conveners. We helped design the impact bond, and it's now in its second year it's now in its fourth year, as my colleagues Gagan and Dayong were saying. We've seen that having very clearly defined learning outcomes has helped drive outcomes as opposed to traditional models, and we have evidence of that. That's the one that's the most advanced. That's a 4-year program. We're testing 4 different models out, and evaluations are done annually. Just by the way of context, the first 2 years we saw fantastic results. All the models which Dayong talked about earlier, they all exceeded targets. And then after the second year, we were actually impacted by COVID, and even then, the focus on outcomes actually helped. Because of the fact that the funding lines were not tied to activities or inputs, but they were tied to outcomes. It allowed us to be flexible in terms of giving service providers more time. So we didn't immediately have to pause or stop funding. In fact, what we were able to do was pivot and say we'll combine evaluations for 2 years as opposed to 1 year, provide the flexibility so they have time to pivot their programs, give them time to reach students. And India, one of the strictest and longest school closures across the world. It gave the service providers the time and the flexibility they needed, and we're looking forward now to the final evaluation later this year. So there we are definitely seeing an example of how innovative financing can help give that flexibility, provide a structure within which service providers are able to focus on what they do as opposed to focusing only on inputs or activities. There are other examples within India as well where we are seeing innovative financing. A couple of years back, there was an impact-linked debt model called Vardhana, which was led by the Dell Foundation, which actually provided low-cost debt to schools through a school financing organization called Vardhana. Actually, I can add a link later on in the chat for more details. That's been a different kind of model apart from impact bonds, which has been tested. And I think the one that is most recent for us at BAT is we are now trialing simpler structures as well as we've worked on impact bonds. Another thing that we are trying to see is, are there simpler, can you combine the flexibility of outcomes-based funding with simpler grants? So one of the things we're trialing is with partners at Dell, Satwa and others, a performance-linked grant on outcomes, where a part of payments is a performance-linked grant as opposed to just paying for enrollment or engagement. So yes, there are payments for enrollment and engagement, and it's a model that allows children to learn at home while schools are closed. It's an EdTech-based model called the Bharat EdTech Initiative, but some part of the payments are linked to outcomes. That's a simpler performance-linked grant. So these are the different kinds of programs we've seen. This program has just started out. The aim is to reach 1 million children over the next 5 years. We know that schools are opening up now, so hopefully, we'll see kids back in school and learning more. And we are coming up with a new impact bond as well, which Emily talked about, a back to school fund, which will combine an impact bond with other components of capacity building in the sector as well to help drive outcomes. So these are a few examples. I hope that was helpful. And over to you, Milena.
Thank you, Krisha. So I was mentioning before, so EOF has the mandate of using outcomes-based financing structure to improve learning outcomes, and we're set up as a hosted fund at UNICEF to do this at scale. So I'll give you the practical examples of the two programs, the two outcomes funds we're about to launch and start implementation for in Ghana and Sierra Leone, and the one in Ghana that Grace already mentioned in her introduction. So these two programs, they are really large-scale programs, and in fact, they're going to be the largest scaled outcomes funds in low and middle-income countries, with a respective size of $17 million and $30 million each. And their key objective is really to improve learning outcomes. So what we're doing is that we're going to be measuring learning gains in literacy and numeracy and controlling this in treatment school versus some control schools. So using a randomized control trial to measure the impact that the interventions have. And to your question earlier around the type of model, impact bond or not, in fact, we're taking a more open approach where we are offering to providers the opportunity to either bid on their own if they have the ability to pre-finance the intervention, or to partner with investors, so that we're not restricting the type of players that can come and play a role in this model. And I think in terms of the question of the contribution of this mechanism to improving learning outcomes, I would say that there's two different types of impact. The first one is the direct impact that the model, that the interventions have on the beneficiaries, on the children. So in Sierra Leone, we're targeting 120,000 children who are going to be receiving the intervention. And in Ghana, it's about probably around 170,000 children. So the programs themselves will have a direct impact on their learning outcomes and hopefully increasing their learning gains. But beyond this, there is also a more systematic impact. And in fact, this is what has been really appealing for the government, particularly in Sierra Leone, where the government really wants to learn about the type of interventions that work. And the objective is to test a variety of interventions that are quite different, to be able to collect data on impact and cost, and then be able to scale up the most promising interventions. So that systemic impact will go a lot further than the children who are going to be receiving directly the intervention, but hopefully will also have an impact on learning outcomes for years to come. And one last thing to mention, I think, in terms of the contribution of the mechanism, and I think that goes beyond the type of model, whether you're choosing an impact bond, a performance-based contract, a performance-based grant, etc. I think these type of mechanisms are really useful to shift the conversation from the cost of activities to the cost of achieving outcomes. And if I take an example that's maybe in another part of the education sector, if we think, for example, around the skills for employment space, very often policymakers and donors have data in their head around how much does it cost to train someone. But very rarely do they know how much does it cost to actually have an impact on that person's life, right? Around helping them get a job, stay in the job market. And so that's only part of the story. And so I think the mechanism is really helpful to really refocus the attention on the outcomes that we want to achieve and make sure that our thinking in terms of impact and in terms of cost is really focused on this cost of the outcomes. And then contributing to building more evidence as Emily and Tanyah were talking about before.
Great, thank you so much, Krisha and Milena, for those really insightful examples. Coming to you next, Dayung and Gagan, it was great to hear the insights from your report earlier. I was wondering if you wanted to build on these a bit further. In particular, what do you think are some unique opportunities that outcomes-based financing brings, and what implications does it have for cost effectiveness and accountability? So over to you both. Did you want to come in first, Dayung, and then Gagan?
Yeah, I'll let Gagan take a stab first and then build on.
Yeah, I think some of the opportunities that outcomes-based financing brings have been talked about, right? So additional capital, cost effectiveness of that capital, so on and so forth. So I won't speak about those again. I think a few things, right? And specifically from an implementer standpoint, I think the outcomes-based mechanisms also help to a large extent in sort of really enhancing the internal organizational capabilities of implementers, right? So that's one. So for example, in our Quality Education India Impact Bond, we have seen the service providers either be able to develop new MEL systems, or be able to track and use the existing metrics that they already had in a much better manner, right? So that's one, just in terms of building their sort of capabilities and so on and so forth. And the second is, I think, also just in terms of enhancing their visibility and reputation in the broader ecosystem. A lot of these NGOs, or some of them that we have worked, were not so well known before, but the outcomes-based mechanism has sort of allowed them to come to the forefront and take their models to sort of newer geographies and lastly, I think the outcomes-based financing from an ecosystem standpoint, aside from what has been said before, I think there's also this point around adding to the data pool that exists, right? So through QEI-DIB, robust outcomes as well as cost data has been made publicly available. So I think those are some things that outcomes-based financing brings. And in terms of implications for a cost effectiveness and accountability standpoint, I think as we were highlighting earlier, that definitely we have seen in our case that the outcomes were quite high. So if these contracts are structured well, then you can actually gain much more efficiency for your dollar.
Yeah, and maybe I'll slightly reframe. I just want to actually slightly reframe the question in terms of not necessarily the unique opportunities that outcomes-based financing brings, but what to me are the next frontier of how do we leverage this kind of mechanism even more to unlock more opportunities. And I think that also links really well to some of the questions that the audience raised. So firstly, to pick up actually on Milena's point, I think the low-hanging fruit in terms of demonstrating that these types of mechanisms deliver potentially greater value, but certainly value to the direct beneficiaries, that's already well established. And the next step is really to demonstrate that these outcomes can be scaled and actually influencing government systems. So I think a lot of our conversation has been not only how do these actually affect the children that it's been designed to affect in the, let's say, 4 or 5 year timeframe of the impact bond, but really are these interventions, can they be designed to be almost mainstreamed and adopted once the effectiveness is demonstrated in the right settings by the government? And what does it take to do that? It doesn't mean necessarily the government needs to now procure for outcomes, that would be great. But even to demonstrate what works so that the government can learn and to create interventions that can then be affecting systems level, right? So that would be, I think, one big win. And already with the EOF efforts, the Back to School Outcomes Fund, Impact Bond, there's a lot of focus on achieving that. And then secondly, I think we're also now as an ecosystem being more ambitious on what to measure and incentivize around beyond just what's easy to measure. So just narrowly looking at math and language, right? We've done that. Now we're looking at that in the back to school context with 2 years of learning loss. But the next frontier, as I think Ian and some of the others mentioned, would be how do we make this more holistic to include things like social emotional learning, creativity. I think Emily linked a great article around some of the ways that these less tangible metrics can also be measured and how can those be costed into these mechanisms. And finally, I think someone in the chat mentioned diversity and inclusion. As Gagan pointed out as well, there's really scarce data even to do this type of work, but to be able to actually incentivize providers to go to the hardest to reach children, they actually need to, they don't need to necessarily, but it would be the right thing to do to provide the pricing that accounts for that extra effort to go to that extra mile. So what is that? Is that 50% more, 200% more? So more data and research and investment in that, but also then to be able to price those more accurately going forward for different types of student segments, I think are some of the next frontier sort of opportunities to make these types of mechanisms even smarter. Now, all of that, I think, also go back to the question of costs as well. Upfront, it will require more research and learning to be able to enable that. But I think now the ecosystem's ready. Again, the low-hanging fruit research questions are already answered in many ways. Some questions marks remain, but we'd love to see the field tackling these types of questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gagan and Dayung. I wanted to pause for questions from the audience, and I see that we have a couple of new questions in the chat. So firstly, we have Ian Atfield. So did you want to unmute and ask your question from the panel?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's really interesting what you to see just how this is scaled, because you know I was tangentially involved in some of this agenda several years back, and there, you know, often the cost of doing the evaluations and the testing was almost equaling the amount of money that was being dispersed. But I mean, the acid test of all of this will be when, you know, the real prize is when governments, such as governments of Indian states, local governments, etc., might step forward to actually finance marginalized groups of children, or, you know, areas where there are, you know, certain segments of the population who aren't reaching education themselves. And so I'm sort of curious as to sort of panelists' views on the political economy around this. You know, clearly there are many reasons why the government and public sector fund education in the way they do, you know, directly through teacher salaries and the like. But is there something else that we need in our evidence base to try to move so this actually can go to real scale, which would not be measured in the hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of millions of children? Thank you.
Did you want to respond to that, Gagan and Dayung? And I would also welcome our other panelists to respond, especially Grace and others if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I can start, and maybe Dayong, you can chime in. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and completely agree. I think the next step, basically, or the the real transformational change will only happen if the governments sort of start doing this. And I think, as I was mentioning, there has been some evidence of this happening in developing countries, but not a lot, right? So I gave the example of Andhra Pradesh and Haryana as two states in India, where while we did not pilot impact bonds per se, but still through a smart contracting, we were able to enter into more outcomes oriented mentality. But yeah, I think completely get your point on that one, that you know as we move ahead, there is sort of a need to bring more government into it.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I think governments directly becoming the outcome funders in this structure of an impact bond may not be so easy, as one of the key challenges in procurement, if they save money, next year their budgets get reduced and so on, as we all know. But I think that doesn't mean that these types of mechanisms cannot influence what happens in government, right? The EOF, as well as the Back to School Outcomes Fund, from the design phase, we're looking at, let's say, more indirect models that have low, not only cost, but cost per child, high cost effectiveness, but can actually be rolled out as system-wide and things like that, to then demonstrate the results, and also asking for in-kind contributions, like you said, Ian, teacher training costs and so on. Those are not, I think, negligible. Those are meaningful ways to build buy-in and get these successful models to be mainstreamed. And then the second, I think, is that, again, there are many other ways, like performance-linked mechanisms that Gagan mentioned, not only to procure and find partners, but also to monitor those results that we believe can have real impact on the performance of these models in a tangible way. But yeah, I'd love to also hear, I know, Krisha, from your experience with NSCC in the Skill India Impact Bond, and Milena on EOF, some of your experience as well on this question, if we have time.
Sure. Milena, did you want to chip in? And then Krisha, if you have any insights to add, you're also very welcome to do that.
Sure, very happy to. So I think, I completely agree that actually, like, the kind of wider kind of system adoption and what comes after the impact bond or after the initial program is really what's going to be key as well. I think there is two ways of looking at that. You can either think about the specific interventions, or at least the most cost-effective ones, being scaled up, which is what I was speaking about as a core objective of EOF programs, and what I think several people on this panel have mentioned. And another approach is for the government to scale up the mechanism itself and this kind of outcomes focus. And I think an example that's very interesting for that is the one of Colombia. So not so much in basic education, but more in the employment space. There was a first impact bond that was launched, that was then followed by a second one and an outcomes fund. And now, as part of the national development plan, it is part of the government's priority to leverage this type of instrument. So there's a real kind of shift that is happening, and that is now leading to more and more use of the instruments, which is also a really interesting systematic impact. So I think the role of the government is really key in ensuring that long-term systematic impact, and that's why at EOF, actually, it's a really important principle of ours to have the government as co-funders. So the programs in Ghana and Sierra Leone are funded by FCDO, but also by the government themselves, who are contributing. I see that Grace has her hands up as well, so she might want to contribute to that point.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, just to come in on the Ghana example. So the conversations with the government of Ghana about self-financing interventions, particularly to support out-of-school children, have been going on for probably over 4 or 5 years. FCDO was previously supporting a complementary basic education project in Ghana for about 280,000 out-of-school children. But the final 2 years of that, the final 3 years of that actually, were government piloting implementation of it, and and strengthening its policies and systems to start to move to a place where government could kind of lead and oversee implementation and management of those kind of interventions, and where there was also the discussion about government ongoing financing. At that point in time, there was a government commitment to allocate 1% of the basic education budget to continue CBE for out of school children. And then there was, the practicalities of how does that get done. And what I would say is that the education outcomes focus has made that promise into more of a reality. It might not be 1%, but government has made a commitment, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Finance, to contribute 25 million CDs, which is 15% of the fund amount, to the fund, which is partly focused on out of school children. So I think we see it as a phased approach. We understand Ghana's fiscal constraints, and it's not going to be an immediate handover or transition. But I think the flexibility that the fund can offer, and the fact that government has committed sort of at the highest levels to co-financing means that we're further kind of down that path, and we can kind of work towards that together. That's also where bringing other, social investors and other forms of finance that are kind of non-traditional finance that's potentially more sustainable has been really exciting for us.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. That transitions us nicely to the last part of the discussion, which is around practical considerations for policymakers and practitioners. We've already started talking about this a little bit, but just to delve a little bit deeper, if I could come to you first, Emily. You, of course, have a wealth of experience in this area, and so building on your reflections at the first part of the session, what do you think is needed to implement outcomes-based financing successfully within education? So what are some of the key things that make these initiatives successful, and how do you anticipate and design for disruptions such as COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Yeah, so I think we've sort of jumped into this conversation already, and a lot of my colleagues have answered this question to some extent, but I'll try to drive home the key points. So I think there are four things. One, and that we've heard about today, is when Gagan mentioned strong education providers who are willing and able to be flexible, who are able to work in this outcomes focused way. So one of the advantages of outcomes-based financing is the flexibility to adapt and tailor to the needs of beneficiaries. And so if they're unable or not willing to do that, then a lot of the value add is lost, I think. Second, champions within the sector, and particularly in government, which we were just talking about. I'm sure that, as my colleagues would attest to, it's impossible to achieve this enormous mindset shift without champions. And obviously, that's really critical for sustainability. Third is clearly defined outcomes. Literacy and numeracy are critical. And given the statistics that I presented at the beginning with respect to the learning crisis, we really need to make sure that that children are learning basic literacy and numeracy skills. But also the whole child does matter. This came up in the chat, and where possible, measure outcomes related to other critical skills and competencies, social emotional skills, etc. We know that those skills are also closely linked to the literacy and numeracy. And then the fourth is data, and we've talked a lot about data. And we at Brookings have sort of focused in on what we think are the four types of data that are critical in outcomes-based financing. So the first is a real-time data. So data along the way, knowing what's happening so that in fact that course adjustment can happen. The second is results data. We've talked today about effectiveness data. That's important not only to know about the effectiveness of these interventions, but in outcomes-based financing, critical in terms of the payments. The third is cost data, which we've also talked about. Necessary, to know, first of all, how much funding is needed, but to price these outcomes, along with what we call cost of inaction data. So what happens if you don't invest in these education interventions? This is sort of part of the equation in trying to figure out how to price these outcomes. What happens if you don't invest? So a couple things that we've been doing at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings related to this. We've been focused primarily on two parts of the data component. One is around real-time data, and the other around cost data that I mentioned earlier. So we've been doing research on the landscape of digital tools for real-time data collection that are being used in the education sector in low and middle income countries. And we've created a typology and criteria to consider when selecting these types of tools. So our aim is really to support stakeholders in the education sector, in particular in the outcomes-based financing space, in the selection of these types of tools, and to avoid the costly reinventing of the wheel where new bespoke tools are created for each project. So that's really our hope with that research. And you can read more about that on our website. I think Sarah, who's online, can pop that in. And then we've also been working on costing, as I mentioned, for a number of years. As I mentioned, we developed a cost calculator that can be used for cost analysis and for early childhood and education sectors. So the online tool is called the Childhood Cost Calculator, or C3, and it's based on our earlier cost calculator, which was called SECT. We had an opportunity to engage with the Education Outcomes Fund, for example, when they were looking at their costs for the programs, and provide some guidance in terms of the cost categories and the resource types, trying to get some consistency around these cost categories and resource types is really helpful. As Dayung mentioned, trying to sort of compare apples to apples when it comes to cost is really important. And as more cost exercises are done using the tool when it's launched, we'll be building up a database on costs, which will be made available in an online interactive database. So hopefully that will contribute to the field so that we can, continue to have more data on what does it actually cost to provide these interventions with quality and achieve outcomes. With respect to the second question, this is sort of the million-dollar question. How do you anticipate and design for disruptions such as COVID? If we all knew the answer to that question. But I think that, as mentioned before, outcomes-based financing, there should be, in theory, the flexibility with respect to how you deliver the services. And I think that we've seen that. In fact, our research looking at 14 impact bond projects in low and middle income countries, which was published in December, demonstrated that there was indeed a great deal of flexibility and creative problem solving when the pandemic hit. The challenge in some cases was what to do with the outcomes that are set. So, if there are set outcomes and not being able to change those, and and in terms of the investor payments. So if there isn't, and Milena mentioned that they'll be using a rigorous evaluation method, or randomized controlled trial. This is a really helpful way to sort of tease out the effect of the shocks. I'm not saying that a randomized controlled trial is appropriate or should be used in every impact bond or outcomes-based financing model, but it is indeed helpful when these shocks occur. So with respect to sort of how in outcomes-based financing, or how to prepare for shocks, I think that thinking about the design, taking into consideration, likely there will be many shocks in the future, environmental, political, health, etc. So that's definitely something that should be taken into consideration further as we move forward. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for laying that out so clearly and comprehensively. I'm conscious of time. We have about another 5 minutes. So the last question from my side is going to be to Krisha, Milena, and Grace. Just coming back to you around local context, which of course is a really extremely important factor. We have touched upon this a little bit, but any final reflections on this, particularly around how we should factor in the needs of different contexts, and which of these learnings that we've been talking about today do you think are transferable across different geographies? So if I could come to you first, Krisha, then Grace and Milena. Any final quick thoughts on this?
Thanks, Tanya. I'll talk about context here because I think, as everybody said, this data is all new. The market, we are all still in the learning early stages of all of these instruments that we've talked about today. So context is absolutely everything. I think Dayong said it beautiful. Excellent data will never be there. So context is really, really important, especially when we think about how governments can use all of this data to start paying for outcomes or start contracting for outcomes at scale. And context, I would think of it in almost 3 different ways. One is context on the ground for where this data is going to be used for decision making. And more often than not, the local context, especially in a country like India, it differs from region to region, state to state, even sometimes district to district. So when we are working with stakeholders, knowing that when we are using this data, for example, it's very important to think about in what context is this data going to be used, and using it appropriately. So for example, even in our work on the cost effectiveness guide, we've actually talked about not just the cost of delivering that outcome and where it, but within which context it might work better than another. So you may have something which is more cost effective, but given the particular on the ground context, and even a little slightly more expensive intervention might actually work better. I think the second thing is around the context of the government itself. Governments rarely make decisions basis guides. There are budgets, there are procurement standards, and we have to think of all of that context when we are approaching them, when we are working with them. And that's the third part around context. How do we support stakeholders in using these guidebooks, in using these guides, these numbers more effectively? And I think that is super critical, as we sort of mainstream some of this data and these learnings. In our recently launched skills impact bonds, and that's occasional learning and not education per se, support. It was also about helping the stakeholders understand how outcomes-based tools work, thinking about what skills will be needed and over a longer term period to use these tools. So I think the sector also has to work around these things, and this context is super important when we use this data and think about how to mainstream this. But I'll pause now. I know we only have a few minutes, so back to you, Tanyah, Elena, and Grace.
Great, thank you. Could I bring you in, Grace and Milena?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's going to be a lot of lessons. We had we're at an early stage still in Ghana. We're just about to procure, contract the service providers, social investors. Government is about to do that. So I would say, please watch and track what's happening in Ghana as we move forward. I think the things that I would reflect on from the experience so far of the design and setup of the Ghana Education Outcomes Project. So I think firstly, the need for government buy-in from the very highest level. And I mean, not just the Ministry of Education. We talked about the Ministry of Finance, needing them to be on board for government co-financing. The Attorney General has needed to be involved in contracting processes because this is a completely new public-private partnership mechanism that hasn't been set up in the Ministry of Education before. A whole range of stakeholders that need to understand the objectives of the project, get why government might approach it in this way. So having that buy-in and not just thinking about the Ministry of Education being one. Second, in terms of the market of potential service providers and social investors, thinking really as broadly as possible about that and starting engagement early on. As I said at the beginning, there are kind of the usual suspects, and then there are loads more civil society organizations, NGOs that are doing really great work, but don't have the time to sit down and write policy documents and proposals and things like that. But they're the ones that are really achieving outcomes for marginalized kids and communities. And so knowing that landscape and going further, to find out who's actually being effective and not just kind of who can write well and get the bids is really important. And I think on the social investor side, one thing that was really exciting for government and for us was the idea that this might also drum up, Ghana-based social investment as well. That hasn't really happened. And I think that's partly because we didn't necessarily, I don't think we engaged that that local domestic investor market well enough. It is here, but you know, I think that's something that you know, we kind of tried to engage with, didn't quite get enough. But I would really say, you know, seeing the investment market, domestic and international, and you know, getting some people on board to reach out to them. And it's not the same as education people at all. You know, the same. So it's an education project, but we're talking about investment and finance, and that is fantastic. And then I think finally, just the really important need to communicate very clearly about why these kind of partnerships are being brought together. In Ghana, at the early stages of the design, you know, there was quite a bit of resistance actually from teacher unions, from some civil society organizations, who didn't have much information about the project, but thought that it was a way to try to, in a backhanded way, privatize the education sector, because there had been something along those lines previously that they hadn't been involved in. And that really flagged up the need for, you know, for government to have its comms right, you know, to be really clear that this didn't mean takeover of schools, takeover of teachers, that this was focused on outcomes, that it was focused on equal partnership between schools and NGOs, between government, civil society organizations, and that really strengthened the communications about it, and you know, kind of brought people on board. But I think that communications angle is so important. When we're starting to talk about, you know, bringing in private sector, people need to understand what that means, and feel comfortable with that. So yeah, those are my reflections on how things have gone in Ghana. As I say, the Education Outcomes Project here is running, deliveries due to start this year. It's running up until 2025. So we'll have a lot more to share over the next few years as it goes forward. A lot of opportunity to learn, evaluate. You know, we're contributing to the evidence base through this project as well. So yes, please do keep an eye on.
Thanks very much, Grace. I know we're at time, but just any quick reflections from you, Milena, and then I'll pass on to Mara to offer some conclusion thoughts. So over to you, Milena.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be quick, but I guess in terms of reflections around what we can learn from others and what is transferable, it was fascinating for me to hear about all of the data that came through from the QEI project in India. And I think obviously a lot of things need to be contextualized and really brought back to what is the government's kind of objective in each country, what is the data we have that is relevant on cost and impact, etc. But there is still a lot we can learn from other programs. And one key thing for me is hearing the data around the fact that the mechanism has allowed for the outcomes to be increased by 50% at the same cost. That is completely transferable, right? Because here we're talking about the proof of concept of the mechanism itself, which I think is a really important argument to try to convince others, governments and donors, to really kind of jump on board and try to make much greater use of this type of outcomes-based financing mechanism. So I would say that this type of research and of evidence is really critical for the sector. And in a way, whether it comes from India, Sierra Leone, Ghana, or others, it has the same impact. So I'm very pleased to see that.
Thank you so much, Milena. And thank you so much, everyone, for such amazing reflections and such a rich discussion. Some really great points there from everyone. And I particularly enjoyed all the examples. And it's really exciting to hear about all the new projects that are coming up in this space, which are obviously building on everything that we've learned so far. And so to close the session, I'd like to come to you, Mara, just any final concluding thoughts from you. I know it's never an easy task, but you always do a brilliant job. So over to you, and then we'll end the session. Thank you very much.
I wanted to reflect on the journey we've been on in these past 90 minutes. I thought that Emily really kicked us off with this urge to do something of the pointing out the dismal statistics around learning poverty, and it's really a call to action. And she also pointed out some emerging evidence, like colleagues from Dalberg and Prisha from British Asian Trust, or Milena, Grace. So there are encouraging results coming through, both in terms of our understanding of which intervention work, around our understanding of which mechanism might work. But those projects are still relatively small, although quality education in India is a massive project, is one, and is not sufficient to meet the needs. So I think there is the big challenge of understanding how do we go from what we know from these usually small projects to scale. And but we had insight about interventions. So Gagan in particular was sharing some insight about the type of intervention that we need to pay particular attention to and be intentional. So targeting and action and remedial action seems to be particularly good value for money. And so we are learning which intervention work, and we are learning how to design them and what are the capabilities that are necessary. I just want to shout out for everybody in this community, because building data and the evidence base will be fundamental to continue building on the experience of those who have come before us. And I want to point out the Indigo dataset, where you can find all the projects, and for every project we signpost the evidence prepared by Dalberg, prepared by Emily. There is a lot of great research and working out there, but there is a place you can go to then jump off and see who has worked on this project, where do I find the evidence, and we hope it's a good contribution. For now, thank you so much, and looking forward to see how far we have come in a couple of years from now.
Thank you so much, Mara, for those final thoughts, and big thank you to both our speakers and our audience for joining us today. We will be back on the 9th of March with another Engaging with Evidence session, this time focusing on outcomes-based financing within poverty alleviation. We'll be doing a deep dive into the Village Enterprise project in Uganda and Kenya, and we're really excited to discuss some of the final results and learnings which have come out of the project. We will be sharing more about this event in the coming days, so please do watch this space. In the meantime, have a great rest of the week and see you very soon. Thank you.